Good evening. So the fascinating, certainly I found the study for it this week fascinating, issue of consent. And this series of talks is based on this book, The Air That We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener. Because I only got the book on Thursday night, which is a very short time to prepare a talk on a subject like this. I haven't been able to read the other chapters yet, but I certainly intend to. But as a friend of mine used to say, before I talk, there's something I want to say. And so before I get into the talk for tonight, and before you start timing me on my 15 minutes, I'd just like to tell you a story, true story. I want to take you back to March 1976, which one or two people here might just about remember. Anybody want to admit to being able to remember it? Yep, just three of us then. Actually, you're right. That was the really hot summer, but that came later. You were on a canal? Wait, in March? All right, yeah, that was during the big heat wave. Yeah. And I will admit to you that I was 21, and I was just a few weeks off getting married. And that's relevant to this story. I was a young assistant superintendent in the Fisherman's Mission in a very busy fishing port. Britain had a fishing industry back then. And Lowestoft on the east coast was a very busy port, and all the things that you'd expect to go with a rough fishing port was going on. Probably far too young to be in that situation. I was actually the youngest assistant superintendent that mission ever had. They took me on when I was only 19. And I would find myself alone at night in charge of a 50-bed hostel with 50 drunken trawlermen, due to stumble in from the pub. So you can imagine the kinds of things that I faced. A great education when you're so young. Anyway, the story relates to a guy called Alan. One day I was walking through the canteen, and Alan, experienced trawlerman, 34 years old at the time, he was sat at one of the tables, and in front of him was a small group of 16-year-old lads from the Midlands. You see, they were having difficulty getting enough people to crew the fishing boats. So they sent out appeals in the high unemployment areas of the Midlands. And these young lads, 16, straight out of school, would come. We had two hostels there, 50 beds in each one, and we had one specifically for the younger guys. And they would stay with us whilst they went through their induction course and tried to work out if a life at sea was for them. So very green youngsters straight from the Midlands. As I came up behind Alan was telling them about last night. And Alan's account of last night was one that, I doubt it's actually been possible in the history of sex for anybody to do. The number of things, the number of times that Alan was convincing these 16-year-olds that he had done. And they were sat there open-mouthed, thinking, wow, we're away from home the first time, this is the life. Let's go out with Alan tonight, and hey, lads, we're in. And I waited till he'd finished, and I tapped him on the shoulder, and he was a bit surprised to see that I'd been behind him all the time. I said, come into the office a minute, Alan. And he came in. I said, now, Alan, I'm not sure I heard all of it, so just tell me about last night. A look of horror came on his face. He said, I can't tell you. I said, well, why not? He said, well, you're a missionary. I can't tell you. I said, yeah, but missionary are men, and I'm, a lot older than those lads you're talking to there. He said, yeah, but you've never done it, have you? I'd witnessed Alan a few times. We'd talked about lots of things and about the Christian life. I said to him, actually, no, you're quite right. I've never had sex. But as you know, I'm getting married in a few weeks' time. So I think I can take it. So tell me about last night. And he wouldn't. I said, okay, Alan, I'll tell you about last night. I said, you went out to a pub alone, probably one of the rough dockside pubs. You had far more booze than was good for you, because you do every night. And you, after a while, you became aware that you'd actually been buying drinks for somebody else, a woman who was beside you. And you'd actually had enough to drink for her to look young and desirable, though she was neither. And after a time of buying drinks for her, you agree between you go back to her place. Said, and then you found, well, if I put it politely, what Shakespeare said, that alcohol increases the desire but decreases the performance. What I actually said to Alan, and it's, you won't mind the language, but I was talking to a fisherman. I said, and when you got into bed, you had far too much to drink. Sorry? Is this a what? Yes, it is. It certainly is. Because it comes right to the heart of the issue of sex and the world and what we're doing. Yeah. I said to him, you couldn't get it up. Because that's actually a fact. When a man drinks that much beer, sex becomes impossible. And he stared at me and he said, how do you know all this? Were you there? I said, because I know the reality. I said, I know that everything you said out there was lies. You see, and this is the problem with the world's view of sex. It's all largely built on lies, deceit, pretense, and promises things it can never deliver. What was going on there was actually a clash of Christian and increasingly prevalent worldview of the permissive society. See, Alan was 34. That means he was 18 at the start of the 60s, the swinging 60s. He was 25 when the Summer of Love came on, and you can ask me what that is later if you don't know. I was 13 during the Summer of Love. So I grew up with all this stuff and the real excitement over the birth of the permissive society all around me. But one very important factor of the Christian worldview in sexual politics is the issue of consent, and this is where the talk really begins. But we have to go all the way back to an earlier sexual revolution, one that took place in the 1st and 2nd centuries and onwards. And the question that I want to pose is, what was it like to live in a world where consent had no meaning whatsoever in relation to sex? You see, if you asked a Roman, how much is a little girl worth? And here I'm quoting now from this book. They might have offered a number of answers. She's free if you manage to salvage her as a baby from the rubbish heap where she was disposed of. If slave traders got to her first, then you'd have to pay them perhaps 8 months' wages to own her. Once yours, though, her body belongs to you outright. It is accepted that every master is entitled to use his slave exactly as he desires. The historian Kyle Harper, and I'm still quoting from this book, says, prostitution is a dominant institution flourishing in the light of day, and a visit to a brothel, and they were everywhere, would set you back no more than the price of a loaf of bread. Now that was the typical view and approach to sex in the Greco-Roman world into which Christianity came. Okay, so now this is my comment again. Now, we still live in a world where horrendous sexual abuse is extensive. It is estimated that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will experience it. That means a class of a high school of 30 has 6 teenagers on average who have experienced some form of sexual abuse. And it's not just the girls, it's the boys too. In the Greco-Roman world, that statistic would have been absolutely meaningless. There simply was no category for sexual abuse as a societal wrong. They just didn't see things that way. They would have just said this was normal sex. Let's quote this historian, Kyle Harper, again. A freeborn Roman man considered that he held an unquestioned right to the bodies of lower status women, children, prostitutes, and slaves, whether male or female. What we would call abuse was, to his mind, the obvious and normal use of sex. That's the end of the quote. So here's the point. It was the status of a person, not their consent, age, or gender, that mattered when it came to sex. High-born women were off limits and had to have their chastity carefully protected, usually by restricting their freedoms. And to ensure their virginity before marriage, they were often married as young as the age of 12. That was common. And again, the consent of the woman was a meaningless concept. It had little to do with it. The decision was not hers. Now, I could give you much more about that world, but I think you've got a picture enough. And that brings us to the first and Christian sexual revolution. Into that world came the Christian worldview. So into a world where the prevailing worldview said that sex was all about power and desire, came the Christian revolution that said sex was about consent and restraint. Diametrically opposed. So in many ways, that first sexual revolution was actually the reverse of the revolution of the 1960s. Though actually, surprisingly, gender equality was at the heart of both. The 1960s revolution, enabled by the contraceptive pill, equality, or the beginnings of equality in education and the workplace, and the throwing off of constraint, said that women must be free to behave just like men. Conversely, the first century Christian revolution, in a society that only held up chastity and fidelity for well-born independent women, the Christian revolution actually said that all men should behave like that. So again, diametrically opposed to the society that they were in. That is abstinence before marriage and faithfulness afterwards. Christianity is actually much more revolutionary to the world, I think, than we often give it credit for. So we come to the preaching of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus. In Matthew 19, some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him. They asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? You've still really got a world where, the consent of the woman has got nothing to do with it. It's all about the desire and will of the man. So in other words, they're asking Jesus to endorse the ability of a man to decide the fate of a woman and to use her when he wants to and discard her when he doesn't. Haven't you read, Jesus replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And the implication of what he's saying there is that he made them equally male and female. Different, but equal. Let's go on with the quote about Jesus. And he said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So Jesus' answer goes right back to God's original purpose: equality, fidelity, lifelong commitment based on mutual consent. That was God's creation order. That was the heart of God for men and women. It always was from the beginning. It still actually is today. Now, the Christian marriage service and all the civil marriage services we now have, which are derived from the Christian marriage service actually enshrines all these principles of consent. Now, I've married a lot of people. I am married to just one, but I've married a lot of people. And the whole service is based on consent. In fact, if I'd got any sense that either party was there, not really of their own will, but being coerced by someone else, I would have refused to do the wedding. I've no doubt Jamie would say exactly the same thing. But all the questions I ask, are you free lawfully to marry this person? The law of England requires me to ask that question before I marry someone. And then I say, will you? So it's consent. Will you take this man, will you take this woman to be your lawful wedded husband, your lawful wedded wife? Do you? Do you consent to this? That's the next question. And then the questions after that are about the willingness to enter freely into a loving, mutually respectful, lifelong, faithful relationship. Now, the people of Jesus' day were actually surprised about how clear and strong his line was, even his disciples. Because it says his disciples weren't happy with this, but the Pharisees come back first. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? So they go back to the Old Testament law and say, well, the law of God in the Old Testament allows this. But Jesus is having none of that. In fact, this is rather a surprising comment of Jesus. Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. It was not this way from the beginning. So even the Old Testament law does not adequately reflect the true heart, mind, and purpose of God. It was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. And very few Christians have ever really taken on board just how clear Jesus' teaching is. When I talked to my wife about marriage before we married, I told her that this was my view. Now, obviously, I could never guarantee that my wife at some point wouldn't have had enough of me and want to go. If you knew me, you might think she probably would. But my stand from the beginning was that when I went into marriage, it was for life. And even if for some reason that marriage wouldn't work out, I would not be able to see myself as free to marry again. This is really what Jesus is saying here, way beyond where our Christian churches actually go. So, before we get to the questions, what about the teaching of the apostles? Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Now, we're so used to that, it doesn't seem strange to us. But you think of the world and the picture I've just created. In that world, Paul said this. Now, the Greek word at the time for a wife, and it's used in Thessalonians, is skeuos. When I was first married, I called Chris my skeuos until she discovered what it meant. The meaning of the word skeuos, used for wife in the Greek, is a pot, pan, or other useful instrument about the house, and possibly a wife. So the Greek, the prevailing view, and even the apostles had to use the language of the day, was that a wife was a household principle owned by the husband. So when Paul says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and Christ loved the church so much he laid down his life for us, Paul actually says to me, Derek, are you willing to die for your washing machine? Well, the answer is no, I'm not. Would I be willing to die for Chris? I sincerely hope so, if it ever became necessary and good for her. That's how revolutionary this is. In a world that saw the wife as less than a washing machine, no, you love her and you die for her. And he goes on, for this reason, he goes right back to the original. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. So here we're saying this is a covenant relationship. It's as important as the relationship between Christ and his church, and it's a picture of the relationship between Christ and his church, and it is divine and eternal in its characteristic. Wow. That's what it actually is. However, each of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Well, there's more, we don't have time to go into it. So there's a return to the creation ordinance based on love and respect, i.e. consent, rather than power and ownership. And for this reason, sex within marriage is actually heartily encouraged. Never let anyone tell you that God is against sex. God was never against sex. He invented it. The first sexual thought in the universe was when God said, let us make man in our own image. A male and female, he created them. Sex was God's idea. When the first days of creation, God saw what he had done and said it was good. When he made men and women, he looked at it and said it's very good. And sex was at the heart of the package. It's the twisted view of sex that the world has that is the problem. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 5, do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent, and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, then come together again. It's all based on consent. So in conclusion, perhaps it's not surprising that Christianity found such a strong response among the downtrodden of the day. Celsus, a critic of Christianity, a Roman critic of Christianity, wrote this: Christians are able to convince only the foolish, the dishonorable, and stupid. Only slaves, women, and little children. Well, you can see why. Slaves, women, and little children could be used sexually the way anybody more powerful than them wanted. Is it surprising that when they heard this message, they said, Jesus is for me? Because he is. Jesus was for them. During the 20th and 21st century, because it's still going on, sexual revolution, it seems that almost everything from the first century Christian sexual revolution is actually being thrown away. The idea of fidelity, chastity, lifelong commitment, one man, one woman, an exclusive committed relationship, all these things are being chucked out. The one bit which comes purely from Christianity that is really prized today actually is the issue of consent. In the questions I pose, which it's fine that we don't look at them now, but one of them was, why is it? Because if you actually think about it, consent is the big issue of today. The biggest sexual issue of the day is this question of consent. And you'll notice that for the sake of time, I've gone very little into the way kids were treated, but we can talk more about that when we open it up, if you want to. So consent is actually at the heart of the Christian and godly creation world view. And the point he's really making in the air that we breathe is that when the world picks up on this and prizes consent so highly, it only thinks that way because of us. The world did not think that way till Christianity came along. So I said earlier that the default view of a sinful world is that sex is governed by power and desire. Whatever you desire can be followed, and it's power that enables you to follow it through. The Christian view is governed by consent and restraint. So, that's what I have to say on the subject. Thank you for listening so carefully. And what's next is over to you.
Let's go to those discussion questions maybe. We've not obviously texted in any questions, so we'll just do some stuff from the floor, see if anybody's got anything. If you just stick your hand up if you had a question that maybe arose from your group or anything you were thinking of. Did anybody? have any good ones? All right, I'll give you a moment to consolidate your thoughts. And you can ask a really profound question, George. Is that George? Is that a question? Okay, great.
Have you guys seen a difference in the conversation of consent? Because you're older than a lot of, some people. And
What do you mean?
Has the conversation of consent changed over the years? And do you think it's gotten better, gotten worse, or an understanding of the Christian worldview, that sort of thing?
Well, over the very
Well,
short...
I'm probably the oldest.
Yeah, I've only been alive for a few short years.
Yeah. Yes, the issue of consent certainly has changed. Not among Christians, I don't think, but certainly in the world, because I think an awful lot of people felt themselves in the position where their consent or lack of it didn't matter. I think the prime example of this is the Me Too movement. Now, it's quite clear that a lot of young women in the film industry, they didn't consent in the true meaning of that word, although I'm sure that the men, and it wasn't only Harvey Weinberger, who took advantage of them. Weinstein, thank you. Yeah, Weinstein. He probably said, yeah, but they agreed. Well, I think the meaning of consent in a sense has changed. So if somehow you can persuade, cajole and pressurize someone so that in the end they give in, would probably be Weinstein's definition of consent. And then he would convince himself that it was a consensual relationship. When in actual fact the power dynamics of it were such that these young women really felt that certainly if they ever wanted to pursue a career, they had no choice but to go to the casting couch. And I think the definition of consent out in the world is actually shifting closer to the Christian one. And I think I would define it like this. If that encounter took place but the sex didn't, afterwards would both parties have regretted that it didn't and wanted it to have done? Now that would be consent. No, wouldn't it? No. If they both went away and said, I wish actually we'd taken that further, then they met again. That would be consent. But a young woman who had no such thought in her mind when she went into the situation and is then pressurized and feels she has no choice, that is not consent. And I think one other area where perpetrators, and that's the word I would use, kid themselves over consent. We didn't go near the paedophilia issue, apart from briefly to mention the way that the Roman world viewed it. And now, let me say, first, just a bit of an aside here, I loathe the word paedophile because it's a dishonest word. Now, I have a 4.5-year-old granddaughter, and I look at her the way every genuine grandfather does. She's this beautiful, funny, lively, witty, trustful person, who loves to play. We play games together for hours on end. And the idea that some person could actually think that abusing that trust by introducing sex into it is so horrific. And paedophile means lover of children. Love has nothing to do with that. Love does not abuse. But paedophiles actually convince themselves that in some senses, because the child's gone along with it, that they wanted it too. So there's been a very dodgy definition of consent, which abusers always use. And I think the world is waking up and saying, no, we've got to have a real definition of consent, which says that the person independently, genuinely, would have wanted this to happen if it hadn't. So yeah, I think those are the changes I would see.
Yeah, I'd 100% agree with Derek. I think there is definitely this breakdown of thinking the bar of consent as it's been described is not high enough, and that we need much more. A great, if you want to kind of think about that a bit more, Louise Perry, who is an excellent, she's described herself as a feminist thinker, she's not a Christian feminist thinker. She wrote a brilliant book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, where she basically outlines how much of what basically set out from Christianity went astray, and then she, in her own kind of thinking of why that is, and she talks particularly about how women have been basically abused through hookup culture, and much of what happened in the 60s turned out to not be freedom for a majority of women, but actually turned out to be a form of abuse for them. She begins calling that out, and actually, incredibly, starts calling for a return to more of a Christian foundation and understanding of sex and relationships. And she's coming at this as a secular feminist thinker who's not a Christian. So it's mind-blowing that actually so many people are beginning to recognise that there must be this return whereby we're actually saying, you know, consent as it has been described in the past is not enough, and we need more. We need more than that. We need better than that.
And we have to say it's not one-way traffic. You know, as I said, the later sexual revolution was all about sort of women taking on more of the characteristics and attitudes of men, and that is happening. You know, men are being pressured by powerful women too. It really is not only in one direction. Now, the vast majority of abuse is male to female, but it's not a one-way street.
Did we have any other questions? Did you think of one, George? Great. Anything else?
I'm going to have a question. We were sort of discussing in our group that it's because we are built on. I can't speak about other countries, but in our country we're obviously built on Christian morals. Like consent, it would be widely agreed, but it's the key to Christianity is the restraint side of it. And sometimes, even when consent is there, it can still be damaging because it's waiting for the right time and person in that group. That's basically what we're saying. Any more thoughts on that?
No, that's very astute thinking. No, the idea that there is consent somehow means that everything is okay. I think a huge number of relationships are actually toxic, even when both parties are fully consenting to it, because they're indulging in practices or indulging in them in such a way that is actually demeaning, demoralizing to the people involved. It does not love them, respect them, and build them up. I didn't go on to the later part of my conversation with Alan, but I think you'll see it. The next thing I said to Alan was, I want you to imagine a young boy growing up in Kent. At 13, he goes on a Christian weekend youth conference and hears somebody explain the Christian view of sex and says to himself, I'm going to follow that. So there's going to be no sex before marriage, and when I marry, it'll only be for the rest of my life with that person. So there's several things that flow out of that. One of it is he's actually going to pick that person very carefully and think long and hard before going into it. But then imagine a teenage girl who comes to the same conclusion around the same age and holds to it too. And when those two meet in an East Coast fishing port, as they're in their 20s, and decide to get married, sex for them is a world inhabited only by two people. They've never been in that world with anyone else. It's an exclusive world to them. It's theirs, they own it, and they've got the whole of their lives to explore it and get to know it. Can you imagine that? And he looked at me with tears in his eyes. He said, you're talking about you, aren't you? I said, yes. He said, I would give anything to be able to swap places with you. He said, to be honest, sex to me now is worth less than a plate of sausage and chips. And given the choice, I'd probably go for the sausage and chips. And he actually did come to my wedding, which quite touched me. I don't know if he ever became a Christian or not. The mission actually moved me straight afterwards. So I I got married, I went on my honeymoon. When I came back, I actually was sent to Hull. I didn't set foot in Lowestoft again for a long time. So, but I think we have to stand up for what the real Christian view is. Because I think sometimes there's a kind of FOMO about Christians and a kind of sneaking idea that actually the world might have the better of it. And I don't actually believe that for a moment. And, I've been a Christian minister and a pastor for so many years. And I've heard the stories of so many hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And I believe in the end that anything other than God's way will be destructive to the individual. And I really believe that. And okay, it's hard when you're young and a teenager. Chris wasn't my first girlfriend. Sure, there were times when I thought, is this worth holding out for? Looking back, I'm very, very glad I did.
I suppose I would just acknowledge as well on top of that this is a complicated issue, isn't it? Because alongside that, there have been many that have made to feel ashamed and guilty and just spoken to badly or fed false lies, although I'd agree with everything as Derek is saying, the idea that somehow your sex life will be better if you only have sex with one person, which isn't necessarily true. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, but there probably are a lot of people who have slept around a lot and are sexually satisfied, and I guess if we don't say that, then it becomes a surprise when you discovered somebody who's in that situation. But I suppose it's a step back from that, having that sense before all things. And as we come into any relationship, it's really not what can I take, but what can I give. And if that is the thing that drives everything, then stuff starts to fall into place. So that's where we get in danger, isn't it? If we start making this about, here are the rules, X, Y, and Z, follow this, otherwise you're a worthless loser who should be shamed in the community because of what you've done, versus there is this way of life where we lay down our lives for people and we give everything, that is so opposed to the message of the culture that we hear at the moment, which is, you do you. Alicia and I just had a conversation the other day about how harmful that phrase can be. You wouldn't say that's for a paedophile, would you? It's all right, you do. You do you. And we just go off and we do whatever our hearts decide. No, it's just how do we, in every relationship, in every circumstance, especially when it comes to sex, lay down our own inhibitions and desires and sacrifice everything on the altar and come with this position of love, understanding that's the pathway to human flourishing for not just myself, but for the community and for the world. And that somehow it's not actually, but in some ways it's not even about my own flourishing, it's about the flourishing of the community and the people that I'm around. And when that becomes the driving force, then hopefully the world changes, doesn't it? And the kingdom breaks out. So it's kind of, it's hard, isn't it? It feels like there's this moment now where we need to re-pick up the Christian story, but we must pick it up in a way that is maybe different to how people have encountered the church brandishing it before, where it's not a sense of, we're going to hit people with a stick, but rather here is a beautiful story to live into that isn't actually necessarily about rules, but is much more about a story to live into and to become, rather than a sense of strictness that is imposing and guilt. Does that make sense?
Because the gospel is a gospel of redemption. And we must never tell our story in a way that makes other people say, then it's too late for me. Which is I was talking to some men on the street on Friday evening in the main street. I'd spoken at the Ark, which is a meeting at St. Thomas's, where they welcome people off the streets, homeless people whose lives are absolutely chaotic, and they feed them and they share the gospel with them. And I was speaking there on Friday, and walking down the street afterwards, there's a group of them sat around a bench with the inevitable cans, and one of them said to me, well, it's too late for me. Well, the great thing about the gospel is it's never too late for me. And yet, for someone like me who had the advantage of coming to Christ At 10 years old, they're not from a believing family, and being well taught as a teenager, great, wonderful. Because I knew that, and I saw it, and I had the chance to live it. But it's never too late for anyone, because the gospel is a gospel of redemption, and God can rebuild and restore. And God doesn't have as favourites those who got it right early. It just isn't like that. The whole story, the parable of the workers in the vineyard, the ones that came first thing in the morning and worked through the heat of the day, the ones that came just before knocking off time, the reward was the same. At whatever point you come to Christ, all the benefits of the healing, restoring, saving power of God is the same. And our home and our place in eternity is the same. I've led people to Christ on their deathbed, and heaven will be the same for them as it is for me that's preached the gospel for 50 years.
Shall we stand? We'll just worship as we close.